And so I would think it definitely resulted in a distortion of the sacrament for the priest's family to go to him. And if that means that the family can't go all that often to confession, they have to make a special expedition, perhaps just twice or three times a year, well, so be it. It's better that way than to have a confusion between family life and priestly ministry. Obviously, the priest's ministry in his parish is closely linked with his family, but his role as priest is different from his role as husband and father, and one must on the whole avoid a confusion of roles. To give a less extreme example, in the university, on the whole, I suggested to my university students that they did not come to me for confession. Because I was their university teacher, I thought it was better they should go to my colleague Bishop Basil for confession, because I didn't want there to be confusion of roles between my position as their university teacher, supervisor, possibly their examiner, and the role of spiritual father. I did not adhere to that rigidly, but on the whole, I preferred to keep the roles separate. Otherwise, there is liable to be confusion. So that would certainly be my own view on this, and all the priests in my own circle I have encouraged to follow that pattern.
May I ask a question, and it'll be a yes or no, perhaps, answer. The Church of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, we know, was a dedication to Christ.
Yes.
And was the Church of Hagia Irini, Holy Peace, also a dedication to Christ?
I'm not sure. Good question. Okay. But I'm honestly not sure.
Thank you.
But I think it probably was. It was not a dedication to Saint Irini, but to Christ. Yes, and so I'm not quite sure what was the dedication feast for Hagia Sophia, but it was, I think, always understood as a dedication to Christ, because the other title of the Church of the Holy Wisdom in Constantinople is the Great Church of Christ. In Russia, in Kiev and other places, when they dedicated churches to Holy Wisdom, they kept their patronal festivals on feasts of the Mother of God. And this gave rise to a lot of speculation on the part of Father Sergei Bulgakov. But I can remember talks both by Father George Florovsky and by Father John Meyendorff, in which they said that Father Sergei's theories, fascinating though they are, were really a confusion, and that wisdom is a title of Christ. And this hypostasization of wisdom as a feminine principle in the deity is misleading.
Can you share something about Orthodoxy in the United Kingdom?
All right, yes, I will. How many Orthodox are there in the United Kingdom? Nobody really knows. But at a guess, I would say probably about 250,000. 250,000. That would be persons of Orthodox origin, persons baptized Orthodox, not the number of those who actively practice their faith. Where we can give more exact statistics is how many clergy are there in Britain. And at the last count, I think where I reckoned that taking together bishops, priests, and deacons, there were a little short of 200 clergy. How many parishes? If you mean by parish a place with a church which belongs to the parish, of which they have exclusive use, with a resident priest, I suppose there are about 100 parishes in all the different jurisdictions, perhaps rather more. But if you want to take account of mission centers without a proper church, places where a priest goes perhaps once a month, then it would be over 200, around 250.
It's just England.
This is, let us say, the British Isles. But in effect, the number of churches in Wales, Scotland, and Ireland is very small. Now, we have in England all the variety of jurisdictions, more or less, that you have, though it's on a smaller scale. By far the most numerous group is the Greeks, the Ecumenical Patriarchate. And I would have said, if you'd asked me, say, 10 years ago, I would have said that 95% of the Orthodox in Britain are Greeks. Now, in the other countries of Europe, the Greeks are in a majority, but not such an overwhelming majority. But in Britain, the other groups are rather small. For example, there is a Russian patriarchal diocese under Metropolitan Antony, with many distinguished members, articulate spokesmen for the Orthodox Church. But reading their accounts, again about 10 years ago, they said that the number of due-paying members in the whole of their diocese was 500. That is to say, they, in their whole diocese, have fewer members than a single Greek parish in London would have each Sunday. Because many of our big parishes, Greek parishes in London, would have 500 or 1,000 people there. The main centre for the Greek Cypriots in Wood Green, they have 700 children in the church school with over 80 teachers. And they have 5 priests and 3 deacons looking after them. Well, this is a kind of first-generation immigrant phenomenon where everybody's concentrated together. They then disperse in the second generation. But that illustrates for you how the great majority are Greeks. But the balance has shifted. It is now reckoned that in Britain, following the fall of communism, there are probably about 80,000 Russians. But if 1% of those 80,000 are in church on Sunday, we're lucky. The vast majority of the people in Russia are unchurched. And in London, it's quite a struggle for the Greeks to keep in touch with all the Greeks who are there. But we do have 25 parishes in London with resident priests, in some cases several priests in each parish, with church schools and all youth organizations. But in London, with these 80,000 Russians, the great majority are going to be in London, they've only got 2 churches, one belonging to the Moscow Patriarchate and one belonging to the Church abroad. But though those 2 churches are full, it's only a small proportion of the total number of Russians. So we've got, yes, the Greeks, mainly Cypriots, forming the great majority. The Russian diocese, Moscow Patriarchate, the Russians under the Church abroad, who don't have a bishop in London, but they have a bishop in Germany. And we have quite friendly relations, incidentally, the Greeks with the church abroad in Britain. When the church abroad, they're building a new church, were having the dedication of the domes of the church, they invited the Greek Archbishop to come along to the dedication service of the domes, and he went. And in Dublin, where our church is the only church at the moment, the Greek church, on one Saturday, the Moscow Patriarchate come along and have a liturgy in our church, and the next Saturday, the church abroad come along and have a liturgy in our church. So we are friendly with everybody. I think in America, the relations are not usually as cordial as that. Then we've got Serbs. The Serbs are probably numerically the second largest, more numerous than the Russians. We've got Ukrainians. They come under Constantinople, but have their own bishop in the continent. The Romanians used to have only one parish in Britain. Now they have about 3. The Bulgarians still just have one parish. Then the Antiochian church, they had until recently just one parish in London, opened, I think, in the 1970s. Until the 1970s, there was no Antiochian parish at all in Britain. They have a large community in London with their own church. They've taken over an Anglican church and done it up very nicely. And they're a big parish. But also with the Antiochians, they have about 12 convert parishes, but these are mostly quite small in numbers, perhaps with about 20 to 40 people worshipping on a Sunday. So we've got pretty well the whole range of the different Orthodox churches, though sometimes the groups are quite small. What about the converts? When I totted up the 200 clergy, or thereabouts, a little less in number, I was surprised to find that about 1/3 of the clergy are persons of Western background who joined Orthodoxy as adults. I had no idea there were so many of us. And of that third, I would say it's split roughly 3 ways, in more or less 3 equal groups. There would be about 1/3 of the converts are with the Greek Archdiocese, 1/3 are with the Russian Church under the Moscow Patriarchate, and 1/3 are now with the Antiochians. But there are 1 or 2 convert priests with other groups, some with the Church abroad, some with, I think, the Romanians. I don't think the Serbs have any convert clergy at the moment. We have no equivalent to Scoba in England, which is strange, because in Europe, in almost every other country, there is an inter-Orthodox Episcopal Council. But somehow we in England are still at the prehistoric stage. Neolithic, perhaps. Yes. We have one strong and active monastery, of which you all know because you had Father Zacharias last year, the monastery of St. John the Baptist at Tollisant Knights in Essex, with about 8 monks and nearby about 16 nuns. That is a Stavropegiac monastery. In other words, it doesn't come under any diocesan bishop, but it comes immediately under the Patriarchate of Constantinople. It was founded by Father Sophroni, the disciple of Saint Silvan of Mount Athos, who was, of course, a Russian, but in the late 60s, he petitioned to leave the Moscow Patriarchate and join the ecumenical patriarchate diocese, because he said increasingly the monks who were coming to his monastery were not Russians, and at least 1 or 2 of them were from the church abroad, and he found it was difficult to be under the Moscow Patriarchate, and he felt it would be better to be under the ecumenical patriarchate. And the then Greek bishop in Britain, Archbishop Athenagoras, in his wisdom, said, look, bishops aren't always friendly towards monasteries. You'd do much better to go directly under the patriarchate. And he himself proposed that the monastery should be Stavropegiac. But that is a great blessing to us all in Britain, the presence of that monastery. There are other small monastic groups, but nothing that could be termed a really active and firmly rooted monastery.
Just wondering, how many of those churches that you discussed were English-speaking primarily?
You may well ask. In the though about a third of the clergy are converts, the number of laity who are converts would be much, much less. Perhaps there are not more than a few thousand English Orthodox at the moment. And this is partly because in certain cases the convert clergy are serving in parishes that are predominantly Greek. In other cases, it is because the convert English language parishes are small, whereas the numbers are in the big Greek parishes in London and places like Birmingham. So it's difficult to assess how much English is being used. In the Greek Archdiocese, much too little English. If you go to the big churches in London, you will only hear Greek, even for the church notices at the end of the service. You won't hear a single word of English. The Archbishop, though not very fiercely, has tried to encourage the use of English, but it doesn't get very far. In the Russian diocese, in the Cathedral of Metropolitan Antony, 10 years ago, about half the service was in English and half in Slavonic. Now, much less English, because of the influx of people from Russia. So they ought really to start a second parish, English language.
Perhaps your grace may also belong to
Metropolitan Antony Bloom is the Antony I'm mentioning, because there are, of course, many Antonys about. But in England, Metropolitan Antony means Metropolitan Antony Bloom, now in his late 80s, but still the bishop of the diocese. Just one, before you ask other questions, just one other small point. Until very recently, we have had no theological school in Britain. The only Orthodox theological school in Western Europe is the Institute of St. Sergius, founded by the Russians in 1925, belonging to the Russian jurisdiction in France that is under the Ecumenical Patriarchate. But Archbishop Gregorios has now, in the Greek Archdiocese, founded a rather modest priest's school, which at the present moment doesn't have resident students, but it has 3 times a week evening classes, 3 hours each evening on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, for people who would like to train for the priesthood, and also it is aiming to help people who would like to be lay leaders in the parishes. I hope this can be expanded into a full theological school, but theological schools are extremely expensive to run. You, after all, in the Antiochian Archdiocese have, 250 parishes, but you don't have your own theological school. Can we, with 100 parishes in the Greek Archdiocese, afford a full-scale theological school? We've also started 2 years ago an Orthodox Institute in Cambridge, which is pan-Orthodox in character. That does not claim to be a theological school, but it does offer Orthodox theological teaching, and it has a popular course for spare time study with monthly weekend study sessions, and a certificate, and now it will have a 2-year diploma, which are accredited and recognized by the University of Cambridge. So we are doing something more about theological training. And in these theological school that Archbishop Gregorios is founding, the teaching will be given both in Greek and in English. Our great problem in Britain is the succession, by which I mean the transition from the first generation of immigrants to the second generation born and brought up in the country. Now, in 1940, 60 years ago, there were no more than 4 Orthodox churches in the whole of the British Isles. So you see, 95% of what we have is post-Second World War. And in many of our parishes, the first-generation immigrants, the Greek parishes, are still dominant, which is why there's a great reluctance to have any English, because it is the older people in the parish who, by and large, are the ones who have lots of money, and they are the ones who, by and large, control the parish council. And so our crucial pastoral problem is, how are we to deal with this very difficult transition from an immigrant generation to a generation born and brought up in the West? Now, in America, you were facing this back in the 20s and 30s, if not earlier. And the losses in the interwar period in the Orthodox Church in America were huge. And the losses still go on. Father Thomas Hopko said to me that he reckoned that in his lifetime, the OCA had lost 2/3 of its membership. So there's no reasons for complacency. Now, on paper, the Orthodox Church in Britain is growing in the sense that the number of priests is increasing and new parishes are being opened. But there's no doubt that we are losing huge numbers of our young people. We're not on the whole losing them to other churches, but they're just becoming folklore Orthodox who come at Pascha and at Christmas.
Grace, how many of that second generation are counted in the clergy?
This is a very disturbing feature. Virtually none. I spoke to a clergy meeting of our Diocese of Thyatira, and there were about 60 priests there. And I was speaking a few years ago about the need for us to start a seminary, which has, thank God, begun. And I said, would the convert clergy, those who entered Orthodoxy as adults, not raise their hands? Now I said, among you who are cradle Orthodox, how many of you were born in this country? And not a single hand went up. And this is very disturbing because our Greek Archdiocese has existed for 75 years, since 1923. And we've still not begun to find our clergy from our Orthodox people born and brought up in Britain. And I don't think we shall find a satisfactory solution to keeping our young people until we can have clergy born and brought up in the country. Here in the Greek Archdiocese in America, in most parishes, they would not accept a priest from Greece or Cyprus. They would want somebody American-born. But very few parishes would want one born and brought up in the old country. But in Britain, we are still importing our priests ready-made. And that's a bad thing. We ought to be standing on our own feet. And it's becoming much more difficult to get priests to come from Greece and Cyprus. 50 years ago, Greece and Cyprus were very poor countries, and it was an attractive option to come to the parishes in Britain, which were often quite well off. But nowadays, the priests in Cyprus and Greece are quite well paid, and it's not any more attractive for them to come to England. So we have got to rely on native-grown produce if we are to have a future. And also priests who come from Greece and Cyprus, unless they're very gifted, are unlikely to be able to minister effectively to the young people born and brought up in Britain. They won't understand their problems. Even if they learn English, there's a huge cultural difference. So that is one of the reasons why the Archbishop has started a theological school. He has, I think, in the last 4 years, ordained about 6 to 8 native-born Greeks. So he's working on this. But we've got to do a great deal more. And one of the reasons is, I think, that if you say to a young Greek brought up in England, not speaking any Greek, if you want to be a priest, you have to go and study in Greece. That's not going to be helpful. And even if he does go to Athens or Thessalonica, he'll just be thrown in at the deep end of the swimming pool, and he's unlikely to find anybody who will really help him. There won't be any real pastoral care. I don't know why we don't send more people to Holy Cross, probably because it would be very expensive. Whereas if you go to Greece, you study free of charge, because the state pays for it all. But this is one of our pastoral problems, I think, to keep our young people. I notice the big congregations in London are aging congregations. The churches are full, but you don't see very many people between 20 to 40, and this is very disturbing. So we've got to work on all of that quite hard. And linked then with the question of the young generation is exactly the question of having priests from the Greek born and brought up in Britain. Of course, I see there's also a problem here in America. If in St. Vladimir's they only had native-born Slavs, they wouldn't have very many students in their seminary. It's all converts there, I think. So, of course, Holy Cross is different. They have a problem about not enough priests for the Greek Archdiocese, but they do have Greek candidates. I don't know how many of your candidates to the priesthood are persons of Arab birth and how many are converts. But looking at this assembly, I judge you're getting a lot of convert clergy. And if you were dependent only on the Arabs, you'd be with a problem too, perhaps.
The difference, though, Your Grace, is that the number of parishes in our diocese that are primarily of Syrian Lebanese background are not as large as the number of parishes of convert background.
Because you've grown hugely, and the Syrian Lebanese parishes have not grown in proportion to the English ones.
Even in this first of all, this region is a little bit unique in many ways, but particularly in demographics. But the number of parishes in this region that are old established parishes by Syrian Lebanese people is 8.
Yes.
Out of 50-some.
And that doesn't mean that the number has gone down. Probably it was never more than 8.
No, there's a new one. I mean, Father Seraphim leads one, Father John leads one.
Yes, so that it's not, but it is that the growth has come primarily with the converts, yes.
But during the same time, the OCA has declined.
Yes.
Double, triple.
And it's a question why the OCA has had this problem, but that would take me far from my subject tonight. But I think our problem is, yes, to keep our young people, to start using much more English, and to get native-born clergy. That, at any rate, is the situation in the Greek Archdiocese in Britain. And those are all linked together. And demographically, we are at least 2 generations behind you in America. We are much more similar to the situation of the Orthodox in Canada, for example. Yes.
Your Grace, in the past 10 or 15 years, a strong Orthodox rigorism has become an increasing force in this country. I was wondering if you feel the impact of that very much in Britain or not.
we feel the impact, but not as badly as you do. First of all, we don't have any Greek Old Calendarist parishes in Britain. Or rather, we have only one very small one. Secondly, the people in Britain in the church abroad are not very numerous, and they are, for the most part, yes, quite conservative, but they are not aggressively rigorous. Within our Archdiocese of Thyatira, there are, of course, differences of opinion. And a number of the priests who come from Greece began receiving converts by baptism, because that is quite widespread in the Church of Greece. And I'm speaking of the New Calendar State Church. But our Archbishop put out an encyclical saying that it was forbidden to receive by baptism persons from other churches who had been baptized in the name of the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, with the use of water. And he said it is the custom of the Ecumenical Patriarchate to accept such people by chrismation, and that any priests who would not obey this directive, they better go pack their bags and go back to Greece, which they didn't do. But I would say we haven't had the same the same problems as you've had. But, of course, the Internet is very influential. And I'm afraid some of these groups are very vocal on the Internet. And so our people do read this sort of stuff, and we're having to meet this as a problem. But I don't think it is on the same scale as for you here.
Brother Stephen?
Your Grace, some dialogues that I've run into in the last couple of years with young men are not being encouraged by their parents as to even consider this vocation. I mean, from young lawyer, doctor, I mean, that's it. Have you seen that kind of thing? And my kind of I feed into that a little bit too. What are the parents really saying, that even maybe the church isn't important? I mean, what's the dialogue the kids are picking up on? Because you're saying that you're not seeing the youth.
Yeah.
You know.
I mean, at the moment in Britain, I think we've got as many priests as we can support financially. We don't have parishes which could support a priest without a priest. So we aren't yet at the stage of simply having vacant parishes. The problem is that many of our priests have to work for their living. But what you say about the attitude of parents, I'm afraid, is certainly true of the Greek diocese in Britain. And it's true, unfortunately, of Greece itself, that parents discourage their children from being ordained. They don't see the priesthood as a good thing for their children to follow. And this is the case even with parents who are church people, who are actively practicing. And I'm afraid also there's a lot of opposition against their children going into monasteries, both for men and women. So I'm afraid there is this problem, and it is bound up with the fact that in Greece there is quite a bit of anti-clericalism. And that arises usually when the church is in a dominant position, and when the church enjoys privileges in society guaranteed by the state. That produces very often a certain feeling of hostility among the people towards, at any rate, the clergy. Not so much, I think, towards the monks and nuns. And so one has to say in Greece things aren't terribly good in that way. But perhaps they are getting better than they were in the 70s. And in Cyprus, it's different, I think. The Cypriot people are more conservative than the mainland Greeks. But unfortunately, there have been scandals in the Church of Cyprus involving members of the episcopate, and that has meant in the last few years the Church has considerably lost its good standing in the eyes of the people. That's a sad story. Yes.
Your Grace, that explains well Greece and Cyprus. I wonder if you might speculate about the immigrant experience in Britain and America, where parents continue, even though the church is not in any way established, continue to prevent or discourage their boys from entering the priesthood or the monastic life. If there's something in our ethos somehow that paints the clerical life as something horrendous.
Have any easy answers to all this? I can't produce any, as a magician, produce any white rabbits out of my Kalamapkion on this particular point. Now, but what I do think is extremely important is the attitude of the parish priests, and for that matter, the bishop. And surely the parish priests should be encouraging vocations among young people. And one hopes that the atmosphere in the sanctuary among the servers is such that some of those boys will feel, this is what I would like to do when I grow up. Alas, it's not always that way. And the priests have a great responsibility, I think, to try and foster vocations among the young people by bringing them in to the life of the church at an early stage, by encouraging the children sometimes to read in church, of course making sure they know how to do it properly. But I find, for example, on the eve of great feasts like Christmas and Theophany, when we've got a lot of Old Testament lessons, and certainly at Oxford we read them all in English now, or almost all, it's good to get the children to read from the first chapter of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. When they're about 10 or 11, they can often read it very well. And I think we need to foster their interest and make them feel that the church can use them, and to make them feel that the liturgy is something attractive, that it is a celebration. So there, I think, our responsibility is important. And it's surprising how many people I meet who tell me that actually they started on the path of the priesthood when the bishop visited their parish, and when he talked to them and said, do you think of becoming a priest? And sometimes they say, well, the bishop planted the seed in my mind when I was 8 or 10, and that I forgot about it for many years, but it came back later. So I think if we can have a positive attitude, we the clergy, bishops and priests, and gather them in and make them feel this is something worth doing, then that will help. Many vocations are formed at quite early years, then they disappear in adolescence, but then they come back again later on.
I think it's rare that even a homily would be preached on vocations, which is unusual.
Yes. Mm. So I think that we have a lot we could do, a lot more than is happening now. I think people are getting tired, but yes.
Is there anyone who has a question who has not asked a question? Brother Stephen, do you have a question on it?
Sir.
Oh.
Your Grace, interactions with the Anglican Church. Good, bad, better?
They are courteous, but not as close as they used to be. When the Orthodox first came to Britain, they related to the Anglican Church as the state church. After all, Orthodox in the last century, the early part of this century, were almost all of them used to living in situations where the Orthodox Church was the state church, the national church. And they related to that. Therefore, they related to the Anglicans, who they thought were the state church of the land. And the Anglicans have helped the Orthodox very much in Britain. When we first came to Britain, the Roman Catholics would not have been particularly friendly, still less the Protestant churches. But the Anglicans invited the Orthodox to celebrate services in their churches. The Anglicans, up to about the 50s, would give churches to the Orthodox free of charge, because up until then the Anglican Church was quite a rich church. Then the economic conditions altered, and the Anglicans now would be willing to sell their churches to the Orthodox, but they can't afford to give them away. But the older Orthodox churches are, for the most part, churches that were given by the Anglicans, often for either some footling sum. I think Metropolitan Anthony, who had the use of an Anglican church for 21 years, I think he paid a rent of £1 a year. Then the Anglicans said, we must either charge you a realistic rent or you must buy the church. And he bought the church, but at a quite modest sum. So the Anglicans helped us very much in the early times in Britain, and we should be grateful for that. And they did not do it because they wanted to proselytize us. They did it out of brotherly love. But I would say since the 50s, the situation has changed. And the older generation of Orthodox liked to deal with the Anglicans because they thought this is the state church, it has money, it has political power, they can help us. But now the Church of England does not have the power that it once had and influence in the national life. And it certainly doesn't have the money that it once had. Though the Anglicans in Britain still keep open their cathedrals, and every cathedral has its choir school, and the choral tradition goes on in the cathedrals as in the past, which is quite something, because they are a huge expense to keep up the medieval cathedrals and to keep up the choirs and the daily choral services. But that goes on in pretty well every Anglican cathedral in Britain. However, that's not my subject now. However, so I think the Orthodox in more recent times are friendly with the Anglicans, but they've moved away. And the Orthodox have become much more independent. When I was received into Orthodoxy, it was the custom for the Greek archdiocese to ask permission from the Anglicans if they wished to receive any Anglican converts. There was apparently, though I've never seen the text of it, some agreement between the Ecumenical Patriarchate and the Anglicans that they wouldn't accept converts from one another's churches without permission. And so certainly when I joined the Orthodox Church, though I didn't know it at the time, the Greek bishop wrote to the Anglican Council for Foreign Relations, to whom I would have been known, to ask if they had any objection. And certainly in my early days as an Anglican priest, if I was going to receive anybody, I had to have the permission of my archbishop, and he said, you must get the permission of the diocesan bishop of that Anglican. So I used to write to the Bishop of Oxford or whoever, and they never refused, but I had to ask their permission. Now that stopped in the 1980s, and certainly doesn't happen now. For a long time, the Ecumenical Patriarchate would not accept Anglican clergy. Only the Russians would. But that has ceased now, and we certainly receive them. So there used to be in Britain, as it were, a special relation between the Orthodox and the Anglicans. But this has gradually faded, and we Orthodox no longer see ourselves as under Anglican patronage in Britain. We see ourselves as standing on our own feet. And we're very happy to go to garden parties in Lambeth Palace, but we stand on our own feet. But I would say the relationships are fairly friendly. But naturally the changes that have happened in Anglicanism mean that we Orthodox don't feel nearly as close to them as once we did. But the Anglican Church in Britain, things are a great deal better ordered than they are over here in the Episcopal Church.
Thank you, Your Grace. We will have a little compliment with the canon for preparation for communion.